Let me just play around with this bit. So Warren and I have met at a variety of conventions. The most recent one was at the Amazing Meeting Australia, which was just held earlier this month in Sydney. And we also met at the Global Atheist Convention as well, where he was one of the attendees. Warren is a fantastic person because he is the brains behind the creation of this book, as well as running his own bookstore in Bigham Books. And he regularly appears on the Token Skeptic podcast whenever we're not too busy, in order to talk about fabulous things like books which encourage rationalism and thinking, which I know that many bookstores try to encourage and certainly try to promote out there. So the more we can talk to each other, the more we can support Australian sellers and Australian books, the more we hopefully can get a positive message out there about thinking and getting news about atheism out and about. Hello, Warren.
Hello.
G'day. Should we just start then, I guess?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess the first question I have, and certainly if we wish to have opportunities later for people to ask questions, we can certainly direct them to you. How did this all begin, Warren?
Really, about 5 or 6 years ago, I was in London. I was living there for about 20 years, and I was there listening to people like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens and others talk about all of these things which I'd always found concerned me, and I would occasionally hear some of them say how Australia is a good example of how a secular nation works without the invasiveness of religious institutions, either in their education, politics or anything like that. And it had only been a couple of days earlier that I'd heard from a friend of mine who had taken their child out of a state school because they'd been being taught creationism in their science class. And I knew of a number of other examples of different things that I thought would directly refute the sorts of things that they were talking about, and that kind of bothered me a little bit. And then I kept hearing it more and more, and I thought, well, maybe we should have a country-based look at some of the specifics of religion in society. And I had to start with Australia. It was the place I was most familiar with, and it was just that thought. And then it was a few years later I met up with somebody else who was an atheist, and I told them this idea, and they helped me kick it off.
So at the time you were in England, how did things get moving when you came back to Australia? Was it easy to find Australian atheists?
Generally it was, partly because somebody else did the legwork for me.
Oh! Was that person Chris?
Yeah, Chris identified, spent about a week or so identifying a range of different prominent atheists in Australia, and that was the starting point, that list. And then other authors, as we approached them, suggested other people. So it ended up being about 80 people on the initial list.
That's brilliant. If people aren't aware, Chris Stevenson is the very first essay that you can find in the book. Chris Stevenson, historian, writer and blogger. Her essay is called, I love the title of her essay, by the way. I think it's a fantastic way to start off the entire book, called Felons, Ratbags, Commies and Left-Wing Loonies, Atheism in Australia, 1788 to 2010. And she just essentially sets the entire scene for finding out more about atheism in Australia. Were you surprised to find out about the history of atheism in Australia? Because I certainly was, after reading not only her essay but the rest of the contributors.
Yeah, well, some of the things that she found out were terrific, and some of the things that didn't make it into the final essay, I might add too. I had to be quite brutal in that the essay she delivered me could have actually filled half the book. So we did have to chop it down quite a lot, and hopefully she's a long way into progressing towards a complete book of free thought in Australia, because you tend to find, as in most things, history is written by apparently the victors, or at least the majority, and they tend to overlook a lot of other important inputs into a culture, and Australia's no different to anywhere else. And you see that in history, whether it be the input of women, the input of minority cultures, and atheism in some respects is just one of those minority cultures. but due to the Enlightenment and the post-Enlightenment political fallout in Europe, we had a similar fallout here in Australia, and so she had quite a bit to draw on, a lot more than I knew about by a long shot. In fact, some of it was actually quite hard to find, so she did a great job in digging it out of the trenches.
And try as hard as I like, a small crack appears in my diplomacy dike. By definition, I begin, alternative medicine, I continue, has either not been proven to work or has been proven to work. Do you know what they call alternative medicine that has been proved to work? Medicine! So you don't believe in any natural remedies? On the contrary, actually, before we came to tea, I took a natural remedy derived from the bark of the willow tree, a painkiller that's virtually side effect free. It's got a weird name. Darling, what was it again? Aspirin, oh yeah, aspirin. Which I paid about $1 for down at my local drugstore. The debate briefly abates as our host collects plates, but as they return with desserts, Storm pertly asserts, Shakespeare said at first, there are more things in heaven and earth than exist in your philosophy. Science is just how we're trained to look at reality. It doesn't explain love or spirituality. How does science explain psychics, auras, the afterlife, the power of prayer? I'm becoming aware that I'm staring like a rabbit, suddenly trapped in the blinding headlights of vacuous crap. Maybe it's the Hamlet she just misquoted, or the 6th glass of wine I just quaffed, but my diplomacy dike groans, and the asshole held back by its stones can be held back no more. Look, Storm, I don't mean to bore you, but there's no such thing as an aura. Reading auras is like reading minds, or tea leaves, or star signs, or meridian lines. These people aren't applying a skill, they're either lying or mentally ill. Same goes for those who claim to hear God's demands and spiritual healers who think they have magic hands. By the way, why do we think it's okay for people to pretend they can talk to the dead? Isn't that totally fucked in the head? Lying to some crying woman whose child has died and telling her you're in touch with the other side. I reckon that's fundamentally sick. Do we need to clarify here that there's no such thing as a psychic? What are we, fucking two? Do you actually think Horton heard a who? Do you actually believe that Santa brings us gifts, that Michael Jackson didn't have facelifts? Are we still so stunned by circus tricks that we think that the dead would want to talk to pricks like John Edward? Storm, to her credit, despite my derision, keeps firing off cliches with startling precision, like a sniper using bollocks for ammunition. You're so sure of your position, but you're just closed-minded. I think you'll find that your faith in science and tests is just as blind as the faith of any fundamentalist. That's a good point. Let me think of it. No, wait. No, my mistake. That's absolute bullshit. Science adjusts its beliefs based on what it's observed. Faith is the denial of observation so that belief can be preserved.